Okay, so we're going to get started. Today we're going to take a break from the world of SketchUp and Photoshop and jump back into InDesign and maybe some Illustrator. You guys are going to work for the last time in class on your portfolios today. And that can be a combination of working on your cover or maybe working on some of the pages. Depends on where you are and what step of the process you're in. Remember that your portfolios are due on Monday, May 20th. That's Monday of finals week. You will turn that in along with everything else. So all your regrades, everything should be done on that day. On Wednesday, you do have to come here and check in with me, and then you can work on whatever study, do whatever you want to do. But technically, I have to have class that day because that's the way that the 16-week semester works. But I thought I would have everything due on Monday, and that way you don't have to worry about it or stress about it. So officially, everything's done on Monday. All the assignments are turned in. There's no more regrades after Monday. And then on Wednesday, you just show up and get your credit for showing up. That's it. Okay? So today we're going to talk about portfolio covers and ultimately binding options. You should be well on your way to having a good, well-rounded portfolio. You have a bunch of work done. You have assignments 1 through 5, or 101 through 105 done. Those all need to go into your portfolio. You'll have 106 to add to that as well. You've done some of the pieces of 106, but not all of it just yet. So those need to go in. And then a lot of people are in the other studio classes. You're in 121, you're in 220. Throwing that kind of work in is always a good thing. And it doesn't even matter. That can go first. And I think I might encourage you to put it first. But I have to have an even playing field, so everybody has to put all their assignments from this class in the portfolio. So that's just one of the requirements. When we start talking about covers here, the first thing to think about is what belongs on the cover in the first place. And I think fundamentally, the thing that has to go on the cover, that you can't forget to put on the cover, is your name. And it sounds silly, but you'd be surprised how many times that gets omitted. Well, this portfolio is about you. We talked about in the last portfolio lecture, we talked about the portfolio is the story of you. You're explaining who you are as a designer and what it means to be you as a designer. Therefore, it makes sense that the cover would have your name on it. So below that, or around that or whatever, would be anything else that's relevant to this particular portfolio. The rest of it is optional. So you could say portfolio. You could say design portfolio. If you're an industrial design student, maybe you say industrial design or product design. If you're an architecture student, maybe it's architecture, architecture portfolio, architecture works, selected works. Maybe you even have a date range. This covers 2019, 2018 to 2019. In the case of Alex Holgraf, we see his cover here. He has volumes of his portfolio because he produces so much work. So in this particular cover is volume 4. So you can add a little bit of extra information there, but it really should be fairly simple. I should also point out that sometimes there are specific requirements. You're applying to grad school and there's a requirement in there that says we need to have your candidacy status on the cover or whatever. You're an option 2 candidate. That might be specific for a particular application. But for the most part, if you include your name and one of these other optional items, maybe, that's about all you need. Things that don't belong on your cover, email address, phone number, that kind of stuff doesn't belong there. It belongs on the inside. We talked about that before on that inside page. So let's look at some examples. And I've broken these down into broad categories. The first one is the text only example. And it's a little loose. There's a little graphic there next to it. But essentially, this is dominated by text. We've got a name, we've got architecture portfolio, and that's it. Now, if you're doing just text, font choice, kerning, tracking, all of those things that we talked about in typography become really important because that is the story of you. All you're saying about yourself is based on the choice of font you made. So you really want to be careful if it's only the text. Another example. So this one is text-based, but she has a really cool signature. So this works for her because she has a really cool scribbly signature. It would not work with my signature. I wouldn't look good. So be aware that if you're going to try to do something like this, it only works if your particular signature looks good and works graphically. Another example here, there's some stuff down here, email and phone number that shouldn't be there. But again, very text-based. We move from just plain text to text with some kind of an abstract background. This could be a piece of some design work that you've done. It could be a drawing. It could be something shadows. The point here is that you can't tell what it is. It's not a specific project. It's just something. So in this case, this is probably a model that he made and a photograph with the shadows or whatever, but it works really nicely as part of the cover. It's abstract. It gains interest. It causes somebody to want to look at it and want to look inside, but it's not overdone and it's not overpowering. That one I find less successful. This one's kind of interesting in its own right, using some masking techniques and whatever in Photoshop. The thing that just kills it for me is the piece of paper that's like stuck on with the drop shadow. Like, it's just not well done. So, and the name isn't even aligned with the paper. So it bugs me. Don't do that. But it's another example. I think this one's really nice. It's clean. The background is abstract, that brushed kind of steel look or brushed aluminum. The challenge here is if this were going to be printed, the font would be so thin that I think you'd lose it in the printing. So you'd need to have a little bit thicker. If it's white on a dark background and you're going to have it printed, you need to thicken up those stroke weights, just a little bit of your text, because otherwise it's going to get lost when you print it. It works fine in a digital fashion, though. So if you're turning this in digitally as a PDF, that would work just fine. And you'd be able to see it just fine. So just be aware of that. Maybe do a test print to see how it turns out. So this one I really struggle with. It says portfolio, and I think the person who did it, and I don't know who this person is, I picked this image off the internet, I think the person who did it thought they were really clever with how they shuffled the word portfolio, but I find it really difficult to read. So just be aware that if you do those kinds of things, somebody still has to read it, and they have to understand what on earth that says. Another example here, to me the gray is off. The color of the gray is just a little funky on this one, going from kind of a warm greenish gray to a weird gray. But other than that part, the abstractness, the floor plan in the background, I think it kind of works. You can't tell that it's a specific project, but you can tell that it's architecture in nature. This one's an actual sheet of metal with like a die-cut vinyl sticker over the top. That's another option, certainly, especially if you're a metal worker. Another example here with the abstract shape background. I think this works nicely. I've seen a lot of these done. A lot of students have done this kind of a background, and I think it works pretty nice. Photographic abstract background. So you take a photo of something like concrete or a texture or something like that and you use that as the background. This person is an urban design planning major. So we're seeing a lot more of the kind of urban scale. So yes, it's abstract, but it's relevant to what they're doing. This one folds around the corner. So imagine this as the spine being in the middle and that's the front and back of the cover. Not quite sure why there's a barcode on it. This is another popular, the city skyline look. I've seen it done many, many times. So it's not particularly unique. I mentioned Alex Holgreff's work before. I think he does a fantastic job with his work, and it's always a good inspiration to look at the kinds of things that he does because he's very carefully considered. This is his Portfolio Volume 3 cover, and I think it works really well both as a whole book. Here it is unfolded, so you can see the whole cover jacket, but also as when it's folded, the fact that on the front you see Folio Volume 3 still makes sense. It's not cut at Olio Volume 3. Like, those kinds of things are really important as you start to play through them. Text with a work, so something that you did or a project. So you take your best project and you make that part of the cover. And so this has a strategy to it. You're trying to to get somebody interested in your particular portfolio, you want them to look at your portfolio, so you put something of high value on the cover. The problem with doing that is you can end up either being redundant because you show the same image inside, or you wasted your best image on the cover, and you don't have anything better to put on the inside. So you have to be a little careful with how this ends up playing out. I think this one is a great cover. It shows a lot of interest. It shows a lot of thought. You have to be really good at sketching to pull this off. So you can't just like decide, oh, I'm going to have a sketch on the front of my cover, and then just sit down with Sears Trace and do a quick sketch and throw it on there. You have to be good at it. You have to have a lot of thought in it. In this particular case, this drawing is probably done many, many times before she settled on this. I think it's a she. He settled on this as his portfolio cover. But I think it works. The other thing to point out about that, though, is if you're going to put a sketch on the cover, be aware that it automatically says that you use pens and pencils and you do things by hand. And sometimes that can put you in that category. So if you did that, let's go back to Lewis's cover here. I have no idea who Lewis is, but let's say that this was your portfolio, you were really proud of it, and you wanted to apply to either a school that was 100% digital based, or you were applying for a firm that did all digital work, and this is the cover that you turn in, it doesn't match. Does that make sense? So you want to be aware of how you fit in the context of what you're applying for. So it's still abstract in this case, but this is obviously part of a project. And I think it works really nicely as a cover. Unless this was like the zombie apocalypse, I'm not quite sure I would choose this as my cover. But yeah. This one works great. This is a student portfolio. Again, not one of my students, but there's something student-like about it. The layering up of paper, the trace, the sketching, it kind of shows that, yeah, this is a student's body of work. And that seems really appropriate. I think it's a really nice cover. Compositionally fantastic with the strong diagonals. So all the same stuff we talked about in the Photoshop section in the very beginning of the class, still applying here with those nice strong diagonals, etc. One of the temptations when you're doing the image on the front cover is to always pick your best rendering and put your best rendering on the cover. Frequently, though, that best rendering ends up being a little bit dark and maybe not as interesting as you think it is. So be aware of overdoing it on that front cover. More examples, this time text with a model as a background. So something you physically constructed, not a digital drawing or anything. It's a little piece. I think this one was done nicely. There's a model that this person made, and they've done a good job of isolating the model with a backdrop. So a lot of this is the photograph, too. Taking a high-quality photograph of the model and making it work in context. Cutouts. We've got a few examples of cutouts. Laser cutters can do this. So you could take some kind of a hard acrylic sheet, and you could cut out, and that shows what's underneath. So if you line it up, you have to pay a lot of attention to what's on that first page underneath. But you could do this kind of a setup, and you could certainly do that here. I've had students in the past do these kinds of things. I was looking in my office for one of these, but I couldn't find one of these. But I've had students do that in the past. The binding on these, we're going to move into binding in just a second, becomes a little bit tricky because of the material of the cover. It's thick material. If you're using an acrylic, it's a thick sheet. And so you have to kind of sort through, how do I bind that? And how's it going to turn? And what's it going to feel like? Is it going to feel too bulky or too difficult to turn, etc.? So let's talk about binding options. This is something that's really important for you guys to kind of sort out and to think about. I brought back all of the previous portfolios. They're in the back, so you guys can look at them again. I already had those out for one class, but I brought them back so that you guys can look at them again. This time you'll pay a little bit more attention to the binding options. Most of the newer portfolios should have either a post-it note or a sticker that's on them, because I asked the students, and I will ask all of you guys when you turn yours in, to say where you had it printed, what kind of the binding it was, and how much it cost. And so that's information for future students. I started doing that because I've had students in the past turn in really nice portfolios, and then everybody asks me, well, where do they have it done? Where do they have it bound? I don't know. So at least now it's on the pages. There are some portfolios in the back that don't have stickers on them. Those were so old. They were some of the earlier portfolios before I started having students put stickers on them. So be aware of that. So traditional options, these are the types of bindings that are going to be available at Staples or Office Max or FedEx or one of those kinds of stores. The spiral. It's generally made out of plastic. It theoretically could be made out of metal, though I haven't seen those. The problem with a spiral binding is it causes a misalignment of the interior pages. And I'll show you this both in live form and as a slide in just a second. And depending on how you have your portfolio set up inside, it may or may not matter to you. But I like to point it out because it is something that you should consider as part of your design. It's much better for a one-sided book than a spread because of this misalignment. Recognize that spiral binding takes about 1/4 inch out of the center of your page. It's going to be a bunch of holes. You see it right there? There's a bunch of holes. So if you had something important like text or something in the middle there, it would cut through that when you do the binding. So be aware that you lose a little bit of it. So the misalignment that I'm talking about is this. So see that black bar up at the top of the page? When you go to open the portfolio, one side drops. And it could be, depending on how it was bound, it could be this way or it could be this way. You can see here in this example, that line, see that line that goes across here? Doesn't match up. So if you want that to match, this is probably not the binding for you. So be aware that that is a design decision that you need to make and whether you want to have it spiral bound or not. Next type of binding, there's another example of spiral, is the comb binding. And this can be made either in plastic or in metal. I actually don't have a comb binding up here with me. The plastic ones tend to be really kind of chunky. They're a heavy binding. But it is something that students can use, and it may be something you're interested in. The metal version of it is actually fairly attractive. Staples used to have a great thin metal version of this, and then they stopped carrying it. So that one's not an option anymore. There's no alignment issues when you open it up. Things align across the page. Makes it a very good solution. It still takes about 1/4 inch out of the center of your book for all those little holes, those perforations for the comb to go through. So be aware that you lose a little bit of that as well. So there are some examples. These are the metal ones. I think they look more attractive. They're a little bit lighter weight and feel a little bit better. And then we get into the handmade or the specialty. These are not available generally at Kinko's, FedEx, etc. And there's a bunch of examples of that. Oh, I missed talking about one. There's this other one. I don't have a slide of it. Apologize. The tape binding. And you'll see some of these tape bindings in the back, where it's basically, it's a lot like the comb binding, where everything comes together, but there's a piece of tape that goes around the outside that way. And this works for a lot of people. As well. So then we get into the specialty bindings. These are the ones that you make yourself. I used to have my grad school portfolio in the back, but somebody walked off with it, so I don't have it anymore. But when I did it, I used sheets of watercolor paper. So I actually took the front cover, and then I scored it and folded it so that it made the spine, and then I folded it under, and I ended up gluing it all together. So it became this kind of a tape binding, but without the tape. So I had handmade it. So that's certainly an option. I've had students in the past who've actually sewed their bindings together, and this works. It works really nicely, actually. So these examples will be in the back. It works, keeps everything in alignment, and kind of adds a little nice texture to the front of the page. Another example here, where the student sewed it together. They used white thread, so it kind of meshes up with everything else. This portfolio was actually printed here at school, and I think it turned out really nice. So it doesn't mean you have to go to the fancy print shop. You can do it. So the specialty bindings, sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're made or fabricated. I like this one because even though it's a book, you can kind of see how you could glue things together to make that cover out of a longer sheet of folded paper around the inside. So that's certainly an option for you. You could have it professionally bound somewhere. The internet's great for having these kinds of things done, but you probably don't have time because you won't finish it in enough time. So that's unlikely to happen. So you're going to think about the non-professionally bound options. Another example here, these ones are sewed together in the corners. So there's little square threads around the corners, and they're all tied nicely together. That's a professionally bound one. I thought this one was kind of interesting because of the folds and the fact that it's folded together to make it nested. It is worth kind of trying this out. I had a portfolio, and I used to have it in there. I should dig it out again so you can see it. When I was working on my grad school portfolio, this is about 2005, 4, 5, something like that. 2004. End of 2004, I was working on it. And I was working on it, and I think I did 7 complete portfolios before I settled on my final portfolio. It took me about 6 months because this was obviously a really important portfolio, so I spent a lot of time doing it. I had one option in there that I really liked. I spent a lot of time with it and had these cool little folding pages, and you'd unfold and you'd look at the inside and whatever. And I took it to one of my former professors and I said, what do you think of this? Can you give me some feedback on it? First thing he did was he shook the binding. And when he shook the binding, all the little flaps that I had carefully folded fell out. And then he started looking at it, and the text didn't match next to the page anymore because all the things were folded open. So sometimes you can get caught when you do fancy little folds and stuff because it doesn't always end up the way you think it should be. So just be aware when you do that kind of binding. OK, so today is really about working and about getting you through the process. The one other thing that I'll add to this is I had a student in the past who struggled a lot with the printing process and getting it right. This was his final portfolio, not the one that he turned in for this class. This was one that he did later on and had it reprinted, and he came and brought me a reprint of it because he finally got it right. The print shop that he used, and he encouraged me to tell you this because they did such a good job working with him, was Minuteman Press in Lafayette, and he actually included his invoice in here. Though he ordered 12 of them, so I think it costs a little more than it'll cost you. But anyway, he struggled with FedEx, and then he went to I think Staples, and they couldn't do it right. And so he went through this whole process of struggling, and these guys ended up being really good. So I thought I would pass along that information for you as well. So his will be in the back. He's got some great renderings that are in here as well. I don't think his cover is particularly fantastic. Just saying. So. Generally speaking, most of the portfolios in the back there are A's and B's. There's a few ones that I put in that are a little bit different. This one's an example here. This was an early on portfolio. The content of this portfolio is not that great. However, the cover, he did a laser etched cover. And it's kind of interesting and kind of different. So I included this one for the cover so that you guys can see the cover. Like I said, I couldn't find the ones that were cutouts. I must not have them anymore. So anyway. Portfolios in the back. You guys have the exercise today. I'm not going to do a demo because we've kind of gone through all of this already. Work on the layout. Work on the cover. Whatever seems most appropriate. At the end of the day, post something relevant to your portfolio. If you get to the stage where you want me to have a look at your portfolio, I'm happy to do that as well. But really, this is a big day for you to work. Any questions? No? All right.